Virgin man had never known a woman's touch until the Apache girl asked to ride with him under the burning sun. The blood on his hands wasn't his own, but Ezekiel Thorne wished it were. He stood beside his horse, watching the buzzards circle overhead like black omens against the merciless Arizona sky. 3 days without water, 2 days without food, 1 day without hope. The leather reins slipped through his calloused fingers as he contemplated the inevitable. His mare duchess nickered softly, her once proud head now hanging low. Even she knew their time was running out in this godforsaken stretch of desert between Tucson and nowhere. Ezekiel pulled his hat lower, shielding his weathered face from the sun that seemed determined to cook every living thing beneath it. At 30 years old, he had survived the war, outlasted 3 winters trapping beaver in Montana, and walked away from more gunfights than most men could count. But this desert might finally claim what bullets and blizzards could not. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the whisper of wind across sand and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, cutting through the stillness like a blade, came the sound of hoofbeats. Ezekiel's hand moved instinctively to the colt at his hip. Muscle memory from years of staying alive in places where hesitation meant death. But as the rider crested the ridge ahead, he found himself frozen not by fear, but by something else entirely. She rode bareback on a paint horse, her long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. Apache, without question, and heading straight toward him. Every instinct screamed at him to draw his weapon. The Apache had been raiding settlements across the territory for months, leaving burned homesteads and unmarked graves in their wake. But something held his hand. Maybe it was the way she sat her horse without the aggressive posture of a warrior. Maybe it was the fact that she was alone, which no Apache raider would ever be. Or maybe it was simply that he was too tired to care anymore. She pulled her mount to a stop 20 yards away, just beyond effective pistol range. Smart girl. Her dark eyes studied him with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Taking in his dusty clothes, his exhausted horse, the way his gun hand trembled slightly from dehydration. For long moments, they regarded each other across the shimmering heat waves. 2 strangers in a land that killed the unprepared without mercy. Then she spoke, her English accented but clear. "You are lost, white man." It wasn't a question. Ezekiel found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. Not lost, just taking the scenic route. Her lips curved in what might have been amusement. The scenic route to where? The buzzards' bellies? Despite everything, Ezekiel felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "You got a better suggestion?" She studied him for another long moment, then nudged her horse closer. Close enough now that he could see the beadwork on her deerskin dress, the silver bracelet on her wrist, the way her eyes held depths he couldn't fathom. "There is water," she said finally. "Half a day's ride north. A hidden spring my grandmother showed me when I was small." "And why would you tell me that?" "Because dead men make poor traveling companions." Ezekiel blinked, certain the heat was making him hallucinate. Traveling companions? She gestured toward the endless expanse of desert stretching in all directions. "I am heading to California. The gold fields near Sacramento. I have heard there is work there for those willing to take it, regardless of their blood." The idea was so unexpected that Ezekiel actually laughed, though it came out more like a cough. An Apache woman, heading to California, alone. "Not Apache," she corrected, her voice sharpening slightly. "Chiricahua. And not alone if you have sense enough to accept help when it is offered." Ezekiel looked at his dying horse, then back at the woman who had appeared like a mirage in the desert. Everything about this situation defied logic. Apache ... Chiricahua. Didn't matter the tribe, they were supposed to be enemies. He should be reaching for his gun, not considering her offer. But logic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not with Duchess barely able to stand and his water gone. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ayana." She said it like a challenge, as if daring him to mock it. Ezekiel. Ezekiel Thorne. Well, Ezekiel Thorne, do you wish to live to see another sunrise? Or shall I leave you to discuss philosophy with the buzzards? He looked up at the circling scavengers, then back at this impossible woman who had ridden out of nowhere with an offer of salvation. In all his 30 years, he had never encountered anything quite like this moment. I reckon I'd prefer the sunrise, he said finally. Ayanna nodded once, sharply. Then we ride north. But understand this, white man, I am not your guide, not your servant, and certainly not your woman. We travel together because it serves us both. Nothing more. The emphasis she placed on those last words suggested there might be more to consider, but Ezekiel was in no position to argue. He hauled himself into Duchess's saddle, feeling the mare sway beneath him. They rode in silence at first, Ayanna setting a pace that was swift but not punishing. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, while Ezekiel focused simply on staying upright. The landscape gradually began to change as they climbed into the foothills. The crushing flatness of the desert floor gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and manzanita. The air grew slightly cooler, though the sun continued its relentless assault. You have been in Arizona long? Ayanna asked as they paused to rest the horses in the shade of a massive boulder. 3 years. Came out after the war ended. Which side? Union, 3rd Cavalry. She nodded as if this explained something. You have the look of a soldier. Even now, half dead from thirst, you sit your horse like a man accustomed to discipline. Ezekiel wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation, so he said nothing. Instead, he found himself studying her profile as she scanned the horizon. She couldn't be more than 20, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of experiences beyond her years. What about you? He asked. How does a Chiricahua woman end up speaking English better than half the cowboys in Tucson? Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My father was white, a trader who came to our winter camp when I was 12. He stayed long enough to teach me his language and plant his seed in my mother's belly. Then he left with the spring thaw and never returned. The matter-of-fact way she delivered this information made it somehow more devastating than if she had raged or wept. Ezekiel found himself wanting to say something, anything, to ease the pain he glimpsed beneath her composed exterior. I'm sorry, was all he managed. Do not pity me, Ezekiel Thorne. I am not ashamed of what I am. But I learned early that in this world, a woman of mixed blood belongs fully to neither people, so I make my own way. They remounted and continued north, the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains. True to her word, Ayanna led them to a spring hidden in a narrow canyon between 2 ridges. The water was cold and sweet, and Ezekiel had never tasted anything so wonderful in his life. While the horses drank their fill, he and Ayanna refilled their canteens and water bags. The simple act of slaking his thirst seemed to bring the world back into focus. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds more distinct. He was going to live after all. We should make camp here for the night, Ayanna said as darkness began to settle over the canyon. Travel at dawn when it is cooler. Ezekiel nodded, too grateful to argue. They built a small fire from deadwood and shared what little food remained in their saddlebags. Jerky and hardtack, but it tasted like a feast after 3 days of nothing. As the flames danced between them, Ayanna's face took on an almost ethereal quality in the flickering light. The harsh edges that daylight revealed softened into something that made Ezekiel's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or thirst. He had known women before, of course. Saloon girls and camp followers during the war, a widow in Denver who had warmed his bed for most of one winter. But those encounters had been transactions, brief connections of flesh without deeper meaning. This was different. Sitting across the fire from this enigmatic woman who had saved his life, Ezekiel felt something stirring within him that he couldn't name. It wasn't just gratitude, though that was certainly part of it. It was something more complex, more dangerous. Why California? He asked, as much to distract himself from these unwelcome thoughts as from genuine curiosity. Freedom, she replied simply. In the goldfields, they say a person's worth is measured by their willingness to work, not the color of their skin or the blood in their veins. You really believe that? I believe it enough to risk everything on the possibility. Ezekiel poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. What if you're wrong? What if it's no different than anywhere else? Then I will have learned something valuable, and I will find another path. She met his eyes across the flames. What of you, Ezekiel Thorne? What drives a former cavalry soldier to wander the desert alone, so far from the beaten paths that he nearly dies of thirst? The question hit closer to home than he cared to admit. How could he explain the restlessness that had driven him west after the war? The inability to settle down, to build the kind of life that other men seemed to want so desperately. I guess I'm still looking for something, he said finally. And what is that something? He was quiet for so long that he thought she might have given up waiting for an answer. When he finally spoke, the words surprised him with their honesty. A place where I fit. A reason to stop moving. Ayanna nodded slowly as if she understood completely. Perhaps we are not so different, you and I. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the desert night settled around them like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another from across the canyon. When Ezekiel finally rolled himself in his blankets on the far side of the dying fire, he found sleep elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he was aware of Ayanna's presence just yards away. The soft sound of her breathing, the rustle of fabric as she shifted in her bedroll. He had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. But this was more than simple companionship. There was an electricity in the air between them, a tension that had nothing to do with their different backgrounds or the inherent dangers of their situation. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with dark eyes and copper skin, with a voice that spoke his name like a prayer. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. They broke camp quickly, eager to cover ground before the sun reached its full intensity. The landscape continued to change as they traveled west, the harsh desert giving way to rolling hills covered in oak and pine. By midday, they had reached a stagecoach road that wound its way through the mountains toward California. The sight of wheel ruts and horse droppings was strangely comforting after days in the wilderness. We can follow this to the next town, Ayanna said, studying the dusty road. Supplies, fresh horses if we need them. Ezekiel nodded, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the prospect of civilization. He was beginning to understand that feeling. As they rode side by side down the winding mountain road, he found himself stealing glances at his unlikely companion. In the clear morning light, she was even more striking than she had appeared by firelight. Her profile was clean and strong, her posture erect despite hours in the saddle. But it was more than her physical beauty that drew his attention. There was an inner strength about her, a self-possession that he found both admirable and slightly intimidating. She moved through the world with purpose, unafraid to take risks in pursuit of her goals. It made him acutely aware of his own aimlessness, the way he had been drifting from place to place without any clear destination in mind. "Tell me about the war," she said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. The request caught him off guard. Most people, especially women, preferred not to hear about the ugly realities of battle. What do you want to know? What it was like? What it taught you? Ezekiel considered the question seriously. It taught me that men are capable of incredible cruelty and unexpected kindness, sometimes in the same moment. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. And that the reasons we think we're fighting for aren't always the reasons we keep fighting. You sound as though you question the cause. I believed in the Union, still do, but after 4 years of watching boys die in muddy fields, you start to wonder if any cause is worth that kind of price. Ayanna was quiet for a moment. My people have been fighting for survival for generations. We understand the cost of war, perhaps better than most. There was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. You've seen battle. I have seen my village burned. I have seen children killed for the crime of being born Apache. Jirikawa. I have seen what happens when one people decides another has no right to exist. The pain in her words was like a physical blow. Ezekiel felt ashamed of his own complaints about a war he had chosen to fight, when she and her people were simply trying to survive in a land that was being taken from them piece by piece. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Again, do not pity me. I speak not for sympathy, but for understanding. We both know what it is to lose things we cannot replace. They rode on in contemplative silence, the sun climbing higher overhead. The road began to descend toward what looked like a small settlement nestled in a valley below. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the distant sound of hammering suggested active construction. Harmony Creek, Ayanna said, reading a weathered sign at the outskirts of town. Population 400 and growing. The town was larger than the sign suggested, with a main street lined with businesses and side streets branching off into residential areas. It had the raw, unfinished look of a settlement that was expanding faster than it could properly organize itself. As they rode down the main street, Ezekiel became acutely aware of the stares they were attracting. A white man and an Indian woman traveling together was unusual enough to draw attention anywhere. But in a frontier town where tensions between settlers and natives ran high, it was potentially dangerous. Maybe we should split up, he suggested quietly. Meet later outside of town. Ayanna's response was to sit straighter in her saddle, her chin lifting in defiance. I am not ashamed to be seen with you, Ezekiel Thorne. Are you ashamed to be seen with me? The question hit him like a slap. Was he ashamed? Or was he simply trying to protect them both from trouble? Before he could answer, a man stepped into the street ahead of them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A sheriff's badge glinted on his vest. Hold up there, he called, raising a hand. Need to have a word with you folks. Ezekiel felt Ayanna tense beside him, though her expression remained carefully neutral. He brought Duchess to a halt and waited, every muscle in his body coiled for potential trouble. The sheriff approached with the measured gait of a man who had faced down his share of dangerous situations. His eyes were pale blue and sharp, taking in every detail of their appearance. When his gaze lingered on Ayanna, Ezekiel saw something flicker there that made his jaw clench. Sheriff Marcus Wade, the man introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more formality than courtesy. You folks are new to Harmony Creek. Just passing through, Ezekiel replied evenly. Looking to resupply before we head west. West, you say? Wade's attention shifted between them like a predator deciding which target posed a greater threat. Lot of trouble on the western roads lately. Apache raids, bandits, that sort of thing. The way he said, Apache, while looking directly at Ayanna was not lost on either of them. Ezekiel felt his hand drift toward his gun, then forced it back to his saddle horn. We'll take our chances, he said. Wade smiled, but it never reached his eyes. I'm sure you will. Mind if I ask what brings a white man and a... He paused, letting his gaze rake over Ayanna again. A woman of her particular heritage together on the trail? The insult was carefully worded but unmistakable. Ezekiel felt heat rise in his chest, but before he could respond, Ayanna spoke. We are traveling companions, nothing more. Is there a law against that in your town, Sheriff? Her voice was steady, controlled, but Ezekiel could hear the steel beneath the surface. Wade heard it too, and his smile grew wider. No law against it, miss. Just unusual is all. Folks might get the wrong idea about ... arrangements. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around them, Ezekiel became aware that they had attracted a small crowd of onlookers. Townspeople stood in doorways and gathered on the wooden sidewalk, watching the confrontation with the hungry interest of people starved for entertainment. "Sheriff," Ezekiel said carefully, "we're not looking for trouble. Just supplies and a place to water our horses." "Oh, I'm sure you're not looking for trouble," Wade replied, his tone suggesting the exact opposite. "But sometimes trouble finds us whether we're looking for it or not." He stepped closer to Ayana's horse, close enough that she had to look down at him. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the raid on the Murphy ranch last week, would you, miss? 3 dead, including a woman and her boy. Apache work, from the look of it." Ayana's face remained impassive, but Ezekiel saw her knuckles whiten where she gripped the reins. "I know nothing of any raid. Course not. But you'll understand if folks around here are a mite nervous about your kind wandering through." That was enough. Ezekiel swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the dusty street with a solid thump. The movement brought him within arm's reach of the sheriff, and he saw Wade's hand drop instinctively toward his gun. "Sheriff," Ezekiel said quietly, "the lady and I have been traveling together for 3 days. She saved my life in the desert, and I'll vouch for her character. If you've got a problem with that, you've got a problem with me?" The crowd grew quieter, sensing that the confrontation was about to escalate. Wade looked Ezekiel up and down, taking in the cavalry bearing, the well-maintained Colt at his hip, the steady way he held himself despite his obvious exhaustion. "That so?" Wade mused. "And who exactly are you, mister?" "Ezekiel Thorne, late of the 3rd United States Cavalry." Something shifted in Wade's expression at the mention of military service. Not deference, exactly, but a calculation of odds that hadn't been there before. "Well now, Mr. Thorne, I appreciate your service to the Union, but this here's a civilian matter now. And in civilian matters, I'm the law in Harmony Creek." "I understand that, Sheriff, but I also understand that the lady hasn't broken any laws, and neither have I. So unless you're planning to arrest us for something specific, I'd appreciate it if you'd let us go about our business." The tension stretched between them like a taut rope. Wade's pale eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Ezekiel. Whatever he saw in the former soldier's face seemed to give him pause. "All right then," he said finally, stepping back. "You can conduct your business. But understand this. Any trouble, any complaints from the good citizens of this town, and I'll hold you both responsible." "Clear?" "Crystal," Ezekiel replied. Wade touched his hat brim again, this time including Ayana in the gesture. "Ma'am, Mr. Thorne, enjoy your stay in Harmony Creek." He turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. The crowd began to disperse, though many continued to steal glances at the unlikely pair. Ezekiel swung back into his saddle, acutely aware that their arrival had created ripples that would spread through the small town like wildfire. By evening, everyone in Harmony Creek would know about the white soldier and the Indian woman who had ridden in together. "Thank you," Ayana said quietly as they guided their horses toward what appeared to be a general store. "For what?" "For standing with me. It would have been easier to distance yourself." The simple gratitude in her voice made his chest tighten. "We're traveling together. That means something, doesn't it?" She turned to look at him, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped. He glimpsed something vulnerable beneath the surface, quickly hidden but unmistakably there. "It means something," she agreed. They tied their horses outside Hendrick's General Merchandise and entered the cramped, cluttered store. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous eyes and thinning hair, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed apprehension. "Help you folks?" he asked, his voice pitched higher than it probably normally was. "Need supplies," Ezekiel said, pulling a list from his pocket. "Salt pork, hardtack, coffee, ammunition. Whatever you've got." As Hendricks gathered their provisions, his eyes kept darting to Ayana, who was examining a display of preserved fruits. The man's obvious discomfort would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so potentially dangerous. That everything? Hendricks asked when he had assembled their order on the counter. Ezekiel checked the supplies against his mental list, then nodded. How much? $22. It was highway robbery for what they were getting, but Ezekiel paid without complaint. Arguing would only draw more unwanted attention. As they loaded their purchases into their saddlebags, Ayanna spoke quietly. We should not stay the night. Ezekiel glanced around at the faces, watching them from windows and doorways. The hostility was almost palpable now, fed by Sheriff Wade's none too subtle implications. Agreed. We can make another 10 miles before dark. They mounted up and rode slowly down the main street, acutely aware of the eyes following their progress. But as they reached the edge of town, Ezekiel heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, multiple riders, approaching fast from behind. He turned in his saddle to see 4 men spurring their horses in pursuit. They weren't wearing badges, but the intent in their faces was unmistakable. Ride, he said sharply to Ayanna. She didn't need to be told twice. They kicked their horses into a gallop, racing down the dusty road as shouts erupted behind them. The pursuing riders were better mounted and gaining ground rapidly. There, Ayanna pointed to a narrow trail that branched off the main road, winding up into the hills. We can lose them in the rocks. They veered onto the trail just as the first shots rang out behind them. Ezekiel heard the whine of bullets passing overhead, followed by the crash of hoofbeats on stone as their pursuers followed them into the hills. The trail was treacherous, winding between boulders and along narrow ledges that dropped off into deep ravines. It was not a place to ride fast, but they had no choice. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Duchess stumbled on the loose shale, nearly throwing Ezekiel from the saddle. The mare was still weakened from their desert ordeal, and he knew she couldn't maintain this pace much longer. Up there, Ayanna called, pointing to a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural fortress. We make our stand. They reached the rocks just as their horses began to falter. Ezekiel pulled his rifle from its scabbard and found a position with a clear view of the trail below. Ayanna produced a Winchester from somewhere in her gear, handling it with the easy competence of someone who had learned to shoot for survival rather than sport. The 4 riders appeared around a bend in the trail, pushing their horses hard despite the dangerous footing. Ezekiel recognized 2 of them from the crowd in town, local men who had decided that the law wasn't moving fast enough for their taste. That's far enough, Ezekiel called down to them. Turn around and ride back to town. The lead rider, a bearded man in a worn leather vest, laughed harshly. Don't think so, soldier boy. You and your squaw have caused enough trouble for one day. The slur hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Ezekiel saw her finger tighten on her rifle's trigger, and he knew that the situation was about to explode into violence. Last warning, he called. Go to hell, the bearded man replied, raising his own rifle. Ezekiel fired first, putting a bullet through the man's shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The sharp crack of the rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The other 3 riders scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and scrub brush. Ayanna's Winchester barked twice in rapid succession, and one of the men cried out as her bullet found its mark. A fierce gunfight erupted, the narrow canyon reverberating with the sound of gunfire. Bullets spanged off rocks and whined through the air as both sides sought advantage. But the townsmen were not experienced fighters, and their initial enthusiasm began to wane as the reality of facing trained shooters set in. After 10 minutes of furious but largely ineffective fire, they began to retreat back down the trail, carrying their wounded with them. Ezekiel waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before emerging from cover. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, and he realized that his heart was pounding like a war drum. Are you hurt? He asked Ayanna. She shook her head, but he could see that the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The casual cruelty of the townspeople, their willingness to resort to violence based on nothing but prejudice and fear, had clearly affected her. We cannot go back, she said quietly. No, we can't. They were fugitives now, whether they had intended to be or not. The confrontation in Harmony Creek had escalated beyond anything either of them had wanted, and there would be no going back to explain or apologize. Where do we go? Ezekiel asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the canyon where their attackers had disappeared. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. West, always west. It is the only direction left to us now. They retrieved their horses and continued up the trail, climbing higher into the mountains as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Behind them, Harmony Creek and its poisonous atmosphere fell away like a bad dream. But Ezekiel knew that they would carry the memory of this day with them, a reminder of how quickly the world could turn hostile, how thin the veneer of civilization really was. As they made camp that night in a sheltered grove of pine trees, he found himself watching Ayanna more closely than before. The events of the day had revealed depths to her character that he was only beginning to understand. She moved with quiet efficiency, gathering firewood and preparing their meager meal without complaint. But he could see the weight of what had happened settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "It's not your fault," he said as they sat by the small fire. "Isn't it?" She poked at the flames with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "If you had been traveling alone, none of this would have happened. If I had been traveling alone, I'd be buzzard food by now. Perhaps. But you would not be a wanted man." The truth of that statement hung between them like smoke. By defending her, by standing with her against the sheriff and the townspeople, Ezekiel had crossed a line that he could never uncross. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. The question caught him off guard, forcing him to examine feelings he had been trying to ignore. Did he regret it? The smart answer, the safe answer, would be yes. Associating with her had brought him nothing but trouble and would likely bring more. But as he looked at her across the flickering flames, at the proud set of her shoulders and the vulnerable uncertainty in her dark eyes, he found that regret was the last thing he felt. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness of his conviction. "I don't regret it." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that transformed her features in the firelight. For a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to waver. "Why?" she whispered. It was a simple question that demanded a complex answer. Why had he chosen to stand with her? Why had he risked his freedom, possibly his life, for a woman he had known for only 3 days? "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because ... He stopped, uncertain how to voice the feelings that were taking shape within him. How could he explain that she had awakened something in him that he had thought was dead? That for the first time in years he felt truly alive? Because? She prompted. "Because I'm tired of being alone." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Ayanna's eyes widened slightly, and he saw his own longing reflected there. Slowly, carefully, she moved around the fire until she was sitting beside him. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "I understand loneliness," she said softly. "I have carried it with me like a stone in my chest for so long that I have forgotten what it felt like to be without it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote. When Ayanna finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "In my culture, when a man and woman travel together, share dangers, save each other's lives, it creates bonds that go deeper than blood." Ezekiel's breath caught in his throat. He turned to look at her, seeing his own desire reflected in her dark eyes. "Ayanna." She reached out then, her fingertips barely grazing his cheek. The touch was electric, sending waves of sensation through his entire body. "I know what you are thinking," she said, "that I am Apache ... Chiricahua, that you are white, that the world would never accept what grows between us." "The world has already made its feelings clear," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Then perhaps it is time we stopped caring what the world thinks. She leaned closer, and he caught the scent of her hair, wild and clean like mountain air. His heart hammered against his ribs as she drew nearer, her lips parting slightly in invitation. But even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to close the distance between them, a lifetime of conditioning held him back. He had never known a woman's touch in the way that she was offering, had never allowed himself to be truly vulnerable with another person. He started, then stopped, not knowing how to explain his inexperience without sounding like a fool. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by something that might have been tenderness. You have never... He shook his head, heat rising in his cheeks. At 30 years old, his innocence was an embarrassment that he had carried like a secret shame. But instead of mockery or disappointment, Ayana's expression softened with compassion. There is no shame in it, she said gently. Some things are worth waiting for. She settled back against him, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. The simple gesture was more intimate than anything he had ever experienced, and he found himself trembling with the intensity of it. We have time, she whispered. All the time in the world. As the fire died down to nothing but glowing embers, they held each other in the darkness. Two lost souls who had found something precious in the most unlikely of circumstances. Dawn broke over the mountains like a promise, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very air on fire. Ezekiel woke to find Ayana already stirring the coals of their fire back to life, her movements efficient and purposeful despite the early hour. She had been awake when he finally drifted off, her breathing steady against his chest as she lay curled in his arms. The memory of that intimacy sent warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the growing flames. Sleep well? She asked without looking up from the fire. Better than I have in years. It was the truth. Despite sleeping on hard ground with only a thin blanket between him and the rocky earth, despite the knowledge that they were now fugitives with nowhere safe to run, he had slept like a man at peace with himself for the first time in memory. Ayana glanced up at him then, and he saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. The walls she had kept between them were still there, but they had shifted, becoming more like gates that might be opened rather than barriers meant to keep him out forever. We need to move, she said, rising gracefully to her feet. The men from yesterday will return with others, probably a posse by now. Ezekiel nodded, the practical necessities of the situation reasserting themselves. Romance was a luxury they could not afford, not with half the territory likely to be hunting them by noon. They broke camp quickly and efficiently, working together with the easy coordination of people who had learned to trust each other completely. As they saddled their horses, Ezekiel found himself watching the way the morning light played across Ayana's features, highlighting the strong line of her jaw and the determined set of her mouth. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. Something wrong? No, he said quickly. Everything's fine. The trail they followed wound higher into the mountains, climbing through stands of pine and aspen toward distant peaks that still wore caps of snow despite the summer heat. It was country that would test both horse and rider, but it also offered the best chance of losing any pursuit. As they rode, Ayana shared stories of these mountains, knowledge passed down from her grandmother and the generations of her people who had called this land home. She spoke of hidden valleys where deer came to drink, of caves that provided shelter from winter storms, of ancient paths that connected distant tribes. It was a different way of seeing the landscape, Ezekiel realized. Where he saw obstacles to be overcome, she saw resources to be utilized. Where he saw wilderness, she saw home. Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, he said, during one of their brief rest stops. She was. She taught me that survival is not about fighting the land, but about learning to move with it like water. Ayana's eyes grew distant. She also taught me that the greatest strength often comes from knowing when to yield. Is that what you're doing now? Yielding? She considered the question seriously. Perhaps. Or perhaps I am finally allowing myself to want something more than mere survival. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ezekiel felt his heart begin to race, but before he could respond, the sound of distant gunshots echoed through the canyon below. They were both in motion instantly, gathering their horses and climbing to a rocky outcrop that provided a view of the lower trail. Through the clear mountain air, they could see a dust cloud rising from the direction of Harmony Creek, moving steadily toward their position. "Posse," Ezekiel said grimly. "At least a dozen riders." Ayanna studied the approaching dust cloud with the calculating gaze of a born strategist. "They will reach the fork in the trail within 2 hours. We need to be over the ridge and into the next valley before then." They pushed their horses hard, climbing switchback trails that would have been challenging under the best of circumstances. Duchess, still recovering from their desert ordeal, began to show signs of serious fatigue. Her breathing became labored, and foam appeared at the corners of her mouth. "She's not going to make it," Ezekiel said, patting the mare's sweat-soaked neck. "There is a place," Ayanna said, pointing toward a narrow defile between two towering rock formations. "An old hunting camp my people used. We can rest the horses there, decide what to do next." The hunting camp was little more than a circular clearing surrounded by weathered stone cairns, but it offered something invaluable: complete concealment from anyone following the main trail. A small spring provided fresh water, and there was enough grass for the horses to graze. But as they unsaddled their mounts, both knew that this was only a temporary respite. The posse would not give up easily, and Sheriff Wade struck Ezekiel as the type of man who would take their escape as a personal affront. "We could split up," he suggested as they watered the horses. "You know this country better than anyone. Alone, you could disappear completely." Ayanna's response was immediate and sharp. "No, it makes sense. I'm the one they really want." "You could?" I said no. She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes blazing. "Do you think so little of me that you believe I would abandon you at the first sign of danger? That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Ezekiel Thorne?" The challenge in her voice forced him to examine his own motivations. Was he truly concerned for her safety, or was he simply reverting to the old pattern of pushing people away before they could leave him? "I don't want to see you hurt because of me," he said finally. "And I do not want to see you captured because of choices you made to protect me." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "We are bound together now, whether by fate or chance or simple stubbornness. I will not break those bonds because the path ahead is dangerous." The conviction in her voice left no room for argument. But more than that, it filled something hollow inside him that he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. "Together, then," he said. "Together." They rested through the heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the horses recovered their strength. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they heard what they had been dreading: the sound of voices echoing off the canyon walls below. The posse had reached the hunting trails and was beginning to spread out, searching for sign. From their hidden vantage point, Ezekiel could count at least 15 men, all armed and determined. "They will find our tracks eventually," Ayanna whispered. "We need to move before they think to check this place." But as they began to saddle their horses, Duchess stumbled and nearly fell. The mare's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. "She can't go on," Ezekiel said, his heart sinking. "Not like this." Ayanna examined the horse with gentle, knowing hands. When she looked up, her expression was grave. "She needs rest. Days of it, maybe weeks. Then we go on foot. In these mountains? With winter coming and a posse behind us?" She shook her head. "We would not last a week." They stared at each other in the fading light, both understanding the impossible situation they faced. They could not go forward, could not go back, could not stay where they were. "There might be another way," Ayanna said slowly, "but you will not like it. Tell me." "My uncle." "My mother's brother." He has a ranch about 30 miles north of here, just below the snow line. He might help us." From her tone, Ezekiel sensed there was more to the story than she was telling. But he cast me out when I chose to leave the reservation. Said I was bringing shame on the family by trying to live in the white world. Her voice was carefully controlled, but he could hear the old pain beneath the words. "He has not spoken to me in 3 years. And you think he'll help us now?" "I think he might help his brother's daughter, even if he disapproves of her choices. Especially if the alternative is seeing her captured or killed." It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only option they had. As the voices of the searchers grew closer, they made their decision. They would have to leave Duchess behind, a choice that tore at Ezekiel's heart. The Mare had carried him through hell and deserved better than to be abandoned in the wilderness. But they stripped her of saddle and bridle, giving her the best chance to survive on her own, or perhaps be found by someone who would care for her. Traveling double on Ayana's paint horse, they set out as darkness fell over the mountains. The going was treacherous in the dark, but Ayana guided them with the sure instinct of someone who knew these trails by heart. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and share what little food remained in their saddlebags. As dawn approached, the landscape around them began to change, becoming more rugged and desolate as they climbed toward the tree line. "There," Ayana pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from a valley ahead. "Uncle Joseph's ranch." The ranch was a modest affair, consisting of a log cabin, a small barn, and corrals holding perhaps 24 cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens pecked in the yard, signs of normal, peaceful life that seemed almost foreign after their days of desperate flight. As they approached the cabin, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair worn in traditional braids and weathered features that bore a strong resemblance to Ayana's. His expression grew thunderous as he recognized his niece. "Ayana," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and anger. "What have you done now?" She slid down from the horse and faced her uncle with dignity and tact despite their desperate circumstances. "Uncle Joseph, I need your help." "Help?" Joseph's eyes flicked to Ezekiel, taking in his white skin and cavalry bearing. "This is the kind of help you need. A white soldier who brings trouble to your family's door." "This man saved my life," Ayana replied firmly, "and I saved his. We are bonded by more than convenience." Joseph's expression grew even darker at the implication in her words. "Bonded? You shame yourself and your mother's memory with such talk." Ezekiel had heard enough. He dismounted and stepped forward, his hand conspicuously away from his weapon. "Sir, my name is Ezekiel Thorne. Your niece speaks the truth. She did save my life, and I would do anything to protect hers. We're in trouble through no fault of our own, and we need somewhere to rest and plan our next move." Joseph studied him with eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. "Trouble? What kind of trouble brings a white soldier and my fool niece to my door?" Ayana quickly explained the events in Harmony Creek, the confrontation with Sheriff Wade, and the chase that had led them here. As she spoke, Joseph's expression shifted from anger to concern to something approaching resignation. "You killed white men," he said when she finished. "We defended ourselves," Ezekiel corrected. "We wounded 2, maybe 3. Nobody died. It will not matter. In their eyes, you are a white man who chose an Apache woman over his own kind. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth for that insult alone." The truth of that statement settled over them like a shroud. They all knew what happened to white men who consorted with Indian women, just as they knew what happened to Indian women who were caught with white men. "What would you have us do?" Ayana asked quietly. "Where can we go that they will not follow?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting loyalties and emotions. Finally, he sighed deeply and gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. You look like death, both of you. We will eat, and then we will talk about what can be done." The interior of the cabin was spare but comfortable. furnished with handmade furniture and decorated with traditional Chiricahua artifacts. Joseph's wife, a plump woman named Nerea, clucked over their bedraggled appearance and immediately set about preparing food. As they ate the first hot meal they had enjoyed in days, Joseph questioned them closely about their plans and motivations. He was particularly interested in Ezekiel's background and intentions regarding his niece. "You say you are bonded," he said finally. "What does this mean to you, white man?" Ezekiel felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes upon him. This was clearly a test of some sort, and his answer would determine whether they received help or were turned away. "It means," he said carefully, "that I would rather die than see her come to harm. That I choose her freely, knowing the cost. That I want to build a life with her, if she have me, wherever that life might be possible." Something in his tone must have convinced Joseph of his sincerity, because the older man's hostile expression softened slightly. "And you, niece? What does this bonding mean to you?" Ayanna met her uncle's gaze steadily. "It means I have found someone worth fighting for. Someone who sees me as a woman first, not as Apache or half-breed or any other label the world wants to put on me." Joseph nodded slowly. "And if I help you, what then? Where will you go? What will you do?" "California," Ayanna said without hesitation. "The gold fields as I planned from the beginning. There are places there where a man and woman can disappear, start over with new names and new lives. It is dangerous country. Lawless. More lawless than here?" Ezekiel asked. "At least there we'll be judged by our actions rather than our bloodlines." Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that crackled in the stone hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "There is a way, but it will require sacrifice from both of you." "What kind of sacrifice?" Ayanna asked. "Your past, your names, everything you were before this moment." He turned to look at each of them in turn. "I can get you to California, but you will arrive as different people entirely. New identities, new histories. And once you take that step, there can be no going back." The offer hung in the air between them, both salvation and damnation. To accept would mean cutting all ties to their former lives, becoming strangers even to themselves. "How?" Ezekiel asked. Joseph smiled grimly. "I have ... connections, people who owe me favors. There is a wagon train leaving from Denver in 2 weeks, bound for Sacramento. If you can reach it, I can arrange for you to be listed on the manifest as husband and wife. New names, new papers, everything you need to start over." "And how do we reach Denver without being caught?" "That is the difficult part. The posse will be watching all the main roads, all the towns between here and there. But there are other ways, older ways that most white men do not know." He gestured toward a hand-drawn map hanging on the wall. "There is a trail that follows the old trading routes through the high country. Dangerous, especially with winter coming, but passable for those who know the way." Ayanna studied the map intently. "I know part of this route. My grandmother traveled it in her youth. But the northern section—" "I will guide you," Joseph said simply, "as far as the Colorado border. After that, you will be on your own." The generosity of the offer left both Ezekiel and Ayanna speechless. Joseph was risking everything to help them, despite his disapproval of their relationship. "Uncle," Ayanna whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "Why?" "Because you are family," he replied gruffly, "and because ... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because perhaps there is wisdom in choosing love over fear, even when the world condemns that choice." They spent the next 2 days at the ranch, resting and preparing for the journey ahead. Joseph provided them with warm clothes, better horses, and enough supplies to last several weeks on the trail. But more importantly, he gave them something neither had dared hope for: acceptance. By the time they were ready to leave, he had begun treating Ezekiel not as an unwelcome intruder, but as a nephew by marriage. On their last evening at the ranch, as they sat around the fire making final preparations, Joseph pulled out a small leather pouch. "This was your grandmother's," he said to Ayanna. "She would want you to have it." Inside the pouch was a delicate silver necklace set with turquoise stones. As Ayanna lifted it reverently from the leather, tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought it was lost when the soldiers burned our winter camp," she whispered. "I saved what I could," Joseph replied, "including this." He fastened the necklace around her throat with gentle hands, and Ezekiel felt something profound settle into place. This was more than jewelry. It was a link to her heritage, a blessing from the ancestors who had walked this land for countless generations. "Thank you," Ayanna said, the words carrying depths of meaning that went far beyond gratitude. That night, as they lay wrapped in blankets beside the dying fire, Ayanna turned to Ezekiel with an expression he had never seen before, vulnerable but determined, fearful but trusting. "Tomorrow we begin a new life," she said softly. "But tonight I want to give you something that belongs only to us." She moved closer, her hand coming up to touch his face with infinite tenderness. This time, when she leaned in to kiss him, he did not pull away. Her lips were soft and warm, tasting of coffee and wild honey. The kiss started gentle, exploratory, then deepened as years of loneliness and longing found their release. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, hearts racing with the intensity of what had passed between them. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." What followed was a communion of souls as much as bodies, a joining that transcended physical desire to become something sacred. Under the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed countless such moments throughout human history, they gave themselves to each other completely. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the warmth of shared blankets, Ayanna traced lazy patterns on Ezekiel's chest. "Do you know what name I will take in our new life?" she asked. "Tell me." "Elena Thorne, if you will have me as your wife." The sound of his name linked with hers sent warmth spreading through his entire being. "Elena," he repeated, testing the way it felt on his tongue. "It suits you. And you? What will you call yourself?" "I haven't decided yet. Something simple, ordinary. A name that won't draw attention." "Thomas," she suggested. "Thomas Thorne. It has a solid sound to it. Thomas and Elena Thorne," he mused. "Husband and wife, heading west to start a new life. Do you think we can make it work? Really?" Ezekiel pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Together," she agreed, and in that simple word lay all the promise and hope that two hearts could hold. As dawn approached over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they prepared to leave everything they had been behind and step boldly into whatever they might become. The trail ahead would be long and dangerous, filled with challenges they could not yet imagine. But for the first time in their lives, neither was traveling alone. And in the end, that made all the difference.